On a quiet evening, when the wind feels like a steady sigh against the shutters, you might imagine yourself curled under a blanket, listening as I tell you of ships and oceans, not the harsh clamor of battles, nor the storms that rattled masts and tore sails, but the slower, softer rhythm of the age we call exploration. Picture lantern light flickering across parchment maps, lines inked carefully by hands that trembled not from fear, but from wonder. These maps, with all their jagged coastlines and wide blank spaces, whisper to mysteries just beyond reach. And here's the twist you may not expect. For the sailors, the most astonishing discoveries were not always distant lands or golden treasures, but the small, everyday marvels found along the way. A new spice sent in the air, a bird's cry no one had ever heard, a star brighter than the rest. Stay with me, for as you breathe slowly, I'll carry you across calm waters, through harbors filled with quiet voices and barrels of fruit, into the dim candlelit cabins where explorers sketched notes by the hour. We'll move gently from Portugal's shores to Venice's markets, to the slow hum of Spanish docks. Each step not a rush but a drift, like leaves on a current. The age of exploration was not only a tale of conquest, it was also the story of wonder, of curiosity, of the yearning to know what lay beyond the horizon. And in the chapters ahead, we'll travel slowly together, hand in hand through time, until the maps are filled and your eyes grow heavy with peace. It begins softly, as most great ages do, not with thunder or fanfare, but with a quiet shuffle of feet along Portugal's cobbled streets and the gentle creak of wooden carts rolling toward the harbor, the scent of the sea carrying with it the salt of possibility. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the whisper of ropes against masts and the faint murmur of sailors readying for voyages that, though they could not have known it then, would change the very shape of the world. Yet in the 15th century, those voyages were still tender, still wrapped in uncertainty. For the maps were incomplete, the edges of the known world left blank like patches of night unlit by stars, and men such as Prince Henry of Portugal, later remembered as Henry the Navigator, would gather in quiet halls with astronomers, cartographers, and shipbuilders, speaking in low tones about winds and currents, about the mysterious African coast, about how far a caravel might sail before food and courage ran. Short, and while you imagine the bustle of Lisbon's port, barrels of dried fish rolling onto decks, ropes coiled neatly by young apprentices with hands calloused from labor, you might not expect that the true revolution was not the ships themselves, nor even the brave men aboard, but the instruments, astrolabes glinting in the sun, compasses trembling slightly as if alive, and charts inked with fresh knowledge, because these were the tools that transformed guesswork into guidance, and guidance into discovery. And so, as you breathe gently, let yourself feel the calm rhythm of waves against the hull. For in those days the sea was not only a barrier but also a road, and every whisper wind promised both fear and wonder. Stay with me here, because in a moment you'll see that while kings and princes dreamed of gold and spices, many of the sailors dreamed simply of survival, of reaching a foreign shore to find fresh water, of seeing a coastline that was not hostile but green and inviting, where fruit hung heavy and birds called out with strange, melodic voices. And this is perhaps the soft twist in their story. That exploration, though we often recall as grand and ambitious, was lived in the smallest of details. The warmth of sun on weathered skin, the comfort of biscuits shared among shipmates, the hush of night when the stars, brighter over open water than ever on land, guided them like lanterns hung in heaven. Imagine those sailors lying awake on deck, wrapped in coarse woolen blankets, listening to the lapping of waves, their thoughts not of empire but home, of the hearts they had left behind. And yet the dawn would call them onward, sails swelling, ropes straining, gulls circling above the foam, until Africa's coast stretched before them. First the familiar port of Morocco, then further, past Cape Bojador, where myth said no man could sail safely. And here lies another twist. When Gillies, a Portuguese navigator, finally rounded the Cape in 1434, he found not monsters nor boiling seas, but open water and possibility, proving that fear had been the greatest barrier of all. And once that fear was broken, the path southward opened like a quiet door left ajar. Breathe slowly with me, for you'll notice how history unfolds not in leaps but in steps, each voyage building gently upon the last, like ripples spreading across a pond, and the men who sail further. Nuno Tristeo, Dinis Dias, charted river mouths, traded beads for ivory, and whispered of lands rich and strange, their tales feeding the hunger of those in Lisbon's candlelit courts, where monarchs sat wrapped in velvet, listening as maps filled with new coastlines unfurled on tables. And yet, though wealth drove many expeditions, there was always that quieter current, the current of curiosity, for even a humblest sailor could not help but stare at unfamiliar stars in the night sky and wonder if somewhere, beneath those same constellations, others were looking back. So, as we drift through this chapter, picture not only kings and merchants counting profits, but also the young deckhand tasting a piece of fruit he had never seen before, juice running down his chin, laughter ringing across the deck, or the pilot tracing a finger across a chart, amazed at how much more the world had come into focus since his own youth. And in this way, the age of exploration began not as a sudden storm, but as a slow dawn, light spreading gradually across the map of the world, promising more than anyone could yet comprehend. And as you settle deeper, know that this is only the beginning, for in the chapters to come we'll follow those journeys farther, across oceans, into harbors filled with spices, through encounters with people whose lives were as real and rich as those of the men who arrived by sea. And though history often tells it in loud tones, here we will whisper it softly, like waves brushing sand, so you can rest while we journey together through time. As the 15th century deepened and the tides of ambition carried Portugal further into the Atlantic, the rhythm of the docks changed, for now it was not only the coast of Africa that beckoned but the vast expanse of ocean itself. And if you close your eyes, you can imagine the gentle hum of Lisbon's waterfront, filled with sailor chatter, merchants weighing spices on brass scales, and children darting between barrels, their laughter mingling with the cry of gulls, while beyond the bustle, caravels waited like restless birds, their triangular lateen sails designed to catch shifting winds, their hulls low and nimble, perfect for probing both open seas and narrow rivers. And though many fear the unknown, there were whispers now of islands, Madeira, the Azores, the Canaries, places that rose like green jewels from the Atlantic, promising fertile soil, fresh timber, and waters teeming with fish. And here lies the quiet twist. While later histories often speak of discovery as though it were a single bold leap, in truth it was these stepping stones across the ocean that made the greater journeys possible, each island a lantern in the dark, a safe harbor for weary crews. And in their vineyards and sugarcane fields, Europeans learned how to plant, to settle, and sadly, to exploit practices that would echo across oceans for centuries to come. Breathe with me here, for in a moment you'll notice that even in these early voyages, the story is not only one of brave captains, but of countless unnamed hands. The carpenters who repaired timbers with resin and rope, the women who salted fish and baked hardtack bread, the priests who murmured prayers over departing ships, and the children who waved from shore until the sails dwindled into specks against the horizon, their voices fading into the steady sigh of the sea. And yet what drew them onward was not only the lure of spices or gold, but a gentler hunger too, the hunger for knowledge, for what lay just beyond sight, for whether the horizon was truly an end or simply a bend in the road. When explorers returned from Madeira with stories of forests thick with laurel, of fertile slopes where wheat grew in abundance, of wine pressed from fresh grapes, the court of Portugal leaned closer, their candlelit halls alive with a murmur of opportunity. And so expeditions grew bolder, pressing farther, until by the late 1400s sailors dared to venture past the known currents, their eyes on the setting sun, their faith placed in the stars above. And as you picture this, imagine lying on deck beneath that infinite canopy, the constellations brighter than any lamp, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river light, and a sailor pointing upward, whispering to a friend that those very stars might guide them not home, but into worlds unseen. And here, gently, you'll see how exploration was as much about patience as courage, for voyages lasted weeks, even months, the sea alternating between glassy calm and restless swells, food growing stale, water turning brackish, and still the sailors endured, their songs rising softly in the night, their faith held by rituals, touching a talisman, reciting a psalm, or tracing a cross upon their brow, as if each small act could anchor them against the vastness. And then one morning, perhaps after endless blue, the cry of land would break, not with the clang of bells, but with a ripple of excitement that coursed through every heart, men rushing to the rails to glimpse a shoreline lifting from mist, the green of trees, the sparkle of surf, the fragrance of earth care on the wind. And in that moment, exhaustion dissolved into wonder, for here was proof that the world was wider, richer, more varied than they had dared to dream. And yet, stay with me, because the story deepens. The islands, while blessings, were also lessons in consequence. For European presence brought both exchange and disruption, vines and wheat planted beside sugarcane, but also enslavement of local peoples and importation of labor from afar, the shadow beneath the light of discovery. And though we whisper this gently, it cannot be ignored, for even the age's quiet marvels carried ripples that disturbed many lives. Still, the sailors themselves often saw only the immediate, the relief of landfall, the joy of fresh fruit after salted meat, the cool taste of spring water after weeks of stale casks, the sight of unfamiliar birds and flowers, their colors startling. After so much ocean blue, and these sensations must have lingered in memory, shaping their dreams long after sails turned homeward. And so, as Portugal's navigators charted more islands, building maps that stretched like delicate lace across the Atlantic, Europe's vision expanded, not in sudden leaps but in careful steps, each voyage a stitch binding the known to the unknown. And as you breathe deeply now, you may feel the rhythm of this expansion, steady and soothing like waves lapping against a wooden hull, carrying us from one chapter of the age into the next, where the horizon itself would no longer be limit but invitation. By the middle of the 15th century, Portugal's gaze had fixed firmly southward, and though the caravel slipped from Lisbon's docks with little spectacle, just the quiet labor of men hauling ropes and the creak of timber against tide, their journeys stretched into legends, for beyond familiar waters of Morocco lay the daunting sweep of the African coast, mysterious, vast, and in European imagination filled with both peril and promise. And if you picture it now, breathe slowly and you might see the sails rising against a pale morning sky, the sailors squinting at the horizon as though it might reveal the secrets they sought. For here was the truth. The road to Asia, with its spices and silks, was believed to be hidden along Africa's rim, and each cape, each river mouth, was not merely a piece of geography but a clue in a larger puzzle. So it was that in 1444, expeditions pressed farther, touching the shores of Senegal, describing lands where palm trees swayed and rivers flowed broad and deep, and there they encountered not the monsters of medieval imagination, but people, traders, fishers, families, living with rhythms and traditions of their own. And here's the soft twist. While European chroniclers later spoke of discoveries, in truth these coasts had long been known and mapped by African navigators, their kingdoms thriving, their markets humming, their ships crossing rivers with skill. And so the age of exploration, even in its earliest steps, was less the unveiling of a silent world and more the meeting of two currents, European ambition and African presence, converging under the steady sun. Yet the Portuguese, driven by Prince Henry's vision, measured progress not in the kindness of encounters, but in the length of coastline revealed, and so they named places as though to make them real. Cape Verde, Sierra Leone, scribing them into maps with ink as dark as the ocean itself. And when they returned to Lisbon, their stories carried both wonder and unease, tales of gold dust glinting in riverbeds, of pepper and ivory, of unfamiliar languages and customs, and of dangers, too, for some. Voyages returned fewer than they left, ships broken by storms, men lost to sickness. Yet still the current of exploration did not slow. It deepened, as if the hunger to know outweighed the risks, and so more expeditions set forth, some captains remembered, many forgotten, their names lost even as their journeys extended Europe's view of the world. Imagine, for a moment, the sailors themselves, lying on deck at night, their faces upturned to constellations that seemed closer over the dark sea, the Southern Cross rising where before they had known only the North Star, and how strange it must have felt to see the sky itself change as they drifted south, a quiet revelation that the heavens were broader, more intricate than their childhood nights had suggested. And as you breathe with that image, think also of their return, the sound of bells echoing as ships docked, families running to greet them, barrels of goods rolled onto shore, maps carried reverently to the king's advisors, each voyage adding not only to the wealth of Portugal, but to the fabric of knowledge itself. Still, stay with me, because there is more beneath the surface. In these early explorations lay the beginnings of the Atlantic trade, the capturing and transporting of human beings, first from raids along the African coast, later through networks of purchase and coercion. And though we speak of it softly here, without alarm, It is a truth that cannot be ignored, for exploration carried with it both light and shadow, marvel and sorrow, and the waves that lapped gently against caravels carried not only spices, but also the first stirrings of suffering that would echo for centuries. Yet even as this darker current began, another ran alongside it, the current of science. For Portuguese navigators refined their charts with each journey, noting currents, winds, reefs, and stars, building knowledge that transformed fear into familiarity, so that the once dreaded Cape Ojeda was now a waypoint, the once mythical equator a line crossed with quiet awe. And thus, step by step, Portugal crept further until the coast of Guinea opened before them, lush and green, a place of trade, of meeting, of mingled voices. Imagine that moment, a sailor setting foot on a new shore, feeling the press of humid air, hearing drums in the distance, smelling spices carried by wind, and knowing that he was both very far from home and yet still under the same sun, and in that sensation lay the essence of exploration. Not conquest alone, nor commerce alone, but the sheer, quiet wonder of realizing the world was larger than one had been told. So, as you drift deeper into this story, feel the rhythm of it. Voyages as heartbeats, maps as breaths, the age itself unfolding like the slow unfurling of a sail, and know that each chapter to come will carry us farther still, across capes, into oceans, toward horizons that seemed endless but were, in truth, only the beginning. By the late 15th century, the rhythm of exploration quickened like the steady beat of waves against a wooden hull, and though Portugal had traced much of Africa's curve, the dream grew not only of following coastlines, but of reaching a sea route to the riches of Asia, for pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and silk shimmered like distant stars in the imagination of Europe. It was believed that just beyond the horizon lay a path to those treasures. So as you picture it now, breathe deeply and imagine a harbor at dawn, sails unfurling in a faint breeze, sailors loading barrels of salted fish, casks of wine, and bundles of dried fruit, priests murmuring prayers for safe passage while the families of sailors waved their farewells, the smell of tar and pitch heavy in the air as ships pulled slowly from the quay and into the vastness, their wakes dissolving gently into the tide. And yet behind these simple departures was the careful hand of science. Portuguese navigators refining there, astrolabes charting winds, marking the push and pull currents like the Canary Current and the Gulf of Guinea's calm swells, so that voyages once feared became voyages measured, and voyages measured became voyages accomplished, until men like Diogo Chao and Bartolomé Dias carried their caravels farther south than ever before. Dias, in 1488, pushed past the tip of Africa, encountering violent storms that nearly broke his ships, and when at last he rounded the southernmost point and beheld A, sea stretching eastward, he did not know that posterity would call it the Cape of Good Hope, named not for its serenity but for the possibility it opened, the promise that India and Asia might at last be reached by sea. And if you pause here with me, you'll feel the weight of that moment, not the clash of empires or the clash of swords, but the quiet realization that the map of the world had shifted, that Europe's horizon had widened irrevocably, and that knowledge, once held in fear and rumor, had become a path marked with salt and stars. Stay with me here, because in a moment you'll see that while kings and merchants celebrated Dias's feet in candlelit halls, raising cups of wine to toast the hope of wealth and power, the sailors themselves carried a different memory, of cold nights lashed by wind, of sails straining like living creatures, of the endless spray that soaked their cloaks until skin pruned and bones ached, and of a relief quiet and profound, when calm returned and the sight of unfamiliar coasts confirmed that they had not only survived but broken a barrier older than memory. And so Lisbon hummed with stories of the Cape, merchants imagining spices pouring into their coffers, monarchs envisioning empires stretching to India, while poets and priests spoke of divine providence guiding Portuguese sails. Yet in the small rooms of shipbuilders and map-makers, the focus was not on glory but on detail, the angle of a sail, the curve of a hull, the precise measurement of latitude by the shadow of the sun at noon. Each refinement a whisper that pushed exploration further, and this, too, is a quiet twist, that the age of exploration was not only shaped by daring captains, but by craftsmen whose names never grace chronicles, whose steady work with plane and chisel, ink and quill, turned dream into voyage. Breathe gently with me now, and imagine the dockyards alive at twilight, lanterns glowing against half-built hulls, the smell of sawdust and pine resin mingling with sea air, apprentices hammering nails while masters ran callous fingers along timbers, each ship a vessel not only a wooden rope, but hope and uncertainty, destined to carry men into seas no European had yet charted. And from these humble labors, Vasco da Gama would emerge, setting sail in 1497 to follow Diaz's path and reach India, a voyage that would prove the sea truly connected continents. But before that triumph came the waiting, the dreaming, the sense that the Cape of Good Hope had opened a door that could not be closed, and beyond it lay both promise and peril. For in these years, as Portugal pressed further, Spain watched, its own monarchs restless under the shadow of Portuguese success, and in their courts too, candlelight glimmered on maps, whispers rising of westward routes, of oceans that might lead not around Africa but across the unknown. And so, quietly, the seeds of rivalry were sown. Yet in this chapter, let us remain with the Portuguese, for theirs was a patient, steady unfolding. Each voyage another thread woven into a larger tapestry. Each discovery a lantern in the dark. Picture now a sailor writing by dim light in his logbook, the ink smudged by salt spray, recording not only winds and bearings, but the sight of dolphins leaping beside the bow, the taste of rainwater caught in sails after weeks of brackish drink, the comfort of hearing a shipmate's familiar song rising against the backdrop of the sea. And remember that while kings sought wealth and merchants counted profits, the men who lived the voyages remembered most the small details, the creak of wood, the warmth of sun after storm, the way stars wheeled slowly across the heavens while the ocean stretched endlessly below. And so, as this chapter closes, the image we carry is not only the Cape of Good Hope marked on maps, but men leaning on a railed caravel, staring into the endless horizon with eyes half in fear, half in wonder, knowing that whatever lay ahead, the world had already grown larger, and nothing would ever feel as small as it once had. The story of exploration now drifts gently westward, for as Portugal celebrated the rounding of Africa, Spain's restless gaze turned the horizon of the Atlantic. And here begins one of the quiet ironies of history, that while Portuguese navigators refined their routes along Africa's coast, the Spanish crown, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, listened instead to the persistent voice of a man who believed the riches of Asia lay not east around Africa, but west across a mysterious ocean. And so we find ourselves imagining Christopher Columbus in the candlelit chambers of Spanish courts, unrolling maps with wide blank spaces, his finger tracing westward lines across seas few dare to picture, speaking in calm but insistent tones that the earth was round enough and small enough to cross, that islands rich in spices awaited just beyond the horizon, though many scholars doubted him, arguing that the seas were wider than he knew. And yet, through persuasion, persistence, and a touch of fortune, he secured the support of Spain in 1492, setting sail from Palos with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, small caravels and a clumsy carrack, crewed not by grand adventurers, but by common sailors, many fearful, some criminals granted reprieve. All carry with them the same mixture of dread and wonder that accompanies any first step into the unknown. Picture now the harbor at dawn, villagers watching as sails unfurled, gulls circling overhead, the ships pulling slowly into open water while families whisper prayers. And then imagine the weeks at sea, days blending together under the sweep of blue sky and darker nights, sailors murmuring of mutiny as weeks stretched on without land, rations dwindling, the horizon unchanging, until at last, just before despair turned to rebellion, a cry pierced the night, land and the sight of dark shapes. Against the pale morning sky brought relief so profound that many wept openly, not for gold or glory, but simply for the sight of earth after endless water. And here's the twist. What Columbus believed to be Asia were in fact islands of the Caribbean, lush with palms and warm breezes, peopled by communities who had lived there for generations, their lives woven into the rhythms of sea and soil. And so the meeting was not of empty lands and new arrivals, but of 2 worlds long separate, colliding softly at first, though with consequences that history would later weigh heavily. Yet in those first days, what mattered most to weary sailors was the green of trees, the taste of fresh fruit, the sound of unfamiliar birds, the coolness of streams, and the sheer relief of stepping ashore, their legs trembling after weeks on restless decks. Stay with me here, because in a moment you'll see how quietly transformative this voyage was. Not in the grand clash of civilizations, but in the intimate experience of sailors touching sand, kneeling to give thanks, filling barrels with water, gathering food with laughter, their fear dissolving into gratitude as they realized they had crossed a sea larger than they ever imagined. For Spain, the news was a revelation. Columbus returned with tales of islands fertile and strange, of people generous in trade, of possibilities shimmering like gold. And though he had not reached Asia, his voyages opened a door that would never again close, a passage into lands and lives Europeans had not known, setting in motion currents that would carry both marvel and sorrow for centuries. Yet in this chapter, let us linger on the human side. The creak of ropes as sails were trimmed under Caribbean sun, the sight of sailors shading their eyes as parrots flashed color overhead, the simple joy of drinking clear water under palm shade, their laughter echoing as waves rolled softly against the sand, and perhaps as night fell, their wonder at stars arranged in unfamiliar patterns, constellations shifting, as though even the heavens had changed. These were the true discoveries, the small, sensory moments that made the vast unknown feel real. And it is in such details, not proclamations, that the age of exploration lived most vividly. So, as you breathe deeply, imagine the ships rocking gently at anchor, torches glowing along the shore, the sailors drifting into sleep under a warm sky, unaware that history would remember this voyage as the beginning of a new chapter for the world. But for them, it was simply the comfort of earth beneath their feet, food in their bellies, and the relief of survival, and in that quiet. You'll see how the greatest shifts in history are often felt most softly in the hearts of ordinary people. When Columbus returned to Spain after that first voyage, the bells of Seville rang and the city stirred with wonder, for here was news of islands across the sea, fertile and green, where fruits hung heavy and waters ran clear. And though Columbus still believed he had skirted the edge of Asia, the Spanish crown saw something different, something that stirred both ambition and rivalry. For Portugal's success around Africa had been dazzling, and now Spain held a promise of its own, a western horizon filled with possibilities. So Columbus was sent again, not with 3 modest ships, but with a fleet of 17, a procession of sails cutting across the Atlantic in 1493, carrying settlers, soldiers, priests, and supplies, a reminder that Spain did not intend merely to visit these lands, but to shape them. And so the age of exploration deepened, voyages becoming not solitary adventures, but bridges across the sea. Yet even in their grandeur, the details remained intimate. Sailors leaning against warm rails on the Caribbean sun, listening to waves lap at hulls, settlers clutching rosaries as they prayed for calm nights, captains poring over logbooks by flickering lamplight, marking each day's progress in steady lines of ink. Columbus himself carried both pride and pressure, for each return to Spain brought not only applause but scrutiny, and whispers of doubt grew louder as maps stretched wider, as scholars noted that the islands described were far too small and scattered to be the shores of Asia. And so Columbus sailed again in 1498, and again in 1502, each voyage carrying the weight of expectation, each return shadowed by the quiet question, had he truly found the Indies, or something else entirely? Stay with me here, because in a moment you'll see how softly the truth unfolded. Not in proclamations, but in the slow realization that these were lands unknown to Europeans, places that had lived their own histories for centuries, with languages, traditions, and rhythms of life untouched by Europe's maps. And so the idea of a new world took shape, not all at once, but like dawn, slowly brightening as more ships crossed the Atlantic, and more coastlines came into view. Imagine the sailors on these later voyages, weary yet awed, stepping ashore on coasts where mangroves thickened the air, where mountains rose blue in the distance, where people met them with curiosity or caution, where the scent of flowers and with smoke mingled in the breeze. And think of Columbus himself, older, his hair graying, his health failing, yet still driven by the dream that Asia lay just beyond, still convinced that each new island was another step toward Cathay, though the truth was slipping from his grasp. Spain, meanwhile, moved beyond him, granting charters to new captains, sending fleets to map, to claim, to settle. And so the story of exploration shifted from one man's vision to a wider current, a tide of voyages that would reshape oceans and lands alike. Breathe slowly with me now, and picture a Caribbean harbor at dusk, ships rocking gently, lanterns glowing along decks, sailors gathering on shore to sing old songs under foreign stars, their voices carrying softly over the water, while in Europe, courtiers trace these journeys on parchment, their pens scratching as they outline coastlines, their eyes alight with both wonder and calculation, knowing that each island meant more than palm trees and parrots. It meant territory, power, and the possibility of wealth. And yet, beneath the grand ambitions, The small human details remained. The taste of fresh coconut after weeks of salted meat, the relief of rain soaking weary sailors, the sound of children chasing one another through new settlements, the sight of priests lifting chalices under makeshift roofs, all the while life continued for people who had always lived there, their daily rhythms unchanged at first, their songs rising into the same skies that now echoed with foreign hymns. In this way, the second and third voyages of Columbus carried more than discovery. They carried the quiet beginnings of change, of mingling, of misunderstanding, of adaptation. And it is in these small, fragile moments that the story feels most alive, not the clash of empires, but a sight of smoke curling upward from two different fires on the same shore, drifting together into the night. And so, as we close this chapter, imagine Columbus once more at sea, his ship swaying gently, his gaze fixed westward, the stars above him constant, though the world beneath him had already shifted, and though he never truly understood what he found, the horizon he chased had already redrawn history, softly, steadily, like waves reshaping a coastline one tide at a time. After Columbus, Spain did not rest, for the sea was calling, and the promise of distant lands was too strong to leave unanswered. So new captains rose to take the helm, each carrying not only their own ambitions, but also the weight of the crown. And among them was Vasco Núñez de Balboa, a man whose journey would carry him across not just oceans but jungles, until he stood upon a shore where no European had stood before. Gazing out at waters, he named the South Sea, what we know as the Pacific. Yet before that moment, imagine the long, quiet march through forests that seemed endless, the steady sound of footsteps on damp earth, the rustle of leaves heavy with rain, the slow, careful breath of men carrying supplies through heat and humidity, their clothes sticking to their skin, their eyes searching the canopy for movement. Balboa had begun his journey not as a celebrated admiral, but as a stowaway, slipping aboard a ship bound from the New World to escape dead in Spain. And perhaps this is what made his later achievements feel so strange, that one who hid in a barrel among pigs and provisions would later stride across the narrow waste of Panama and glimpse an ocean no one from Europe had seen. Stay with me here, because in a moment you'll see how this discovery reshaped not just maps but imaginations. For when Balboa reached that ridge in 1513 and looked out over the rolling waters of the Pacific, it was as though a curtain had lifted, revealing that the world was wider still, and suddenly Asia no longer seemed a myth beyond hope, but a tangible destination across a sea yet unmeasured. Picture him kneeling in the sand, raising a sword to claim the ocean for Spain, while behind him men stood silent, awed not only by the scale of what they saw, but by the thought of the journey back. For the jungles they had crossed were no easier on the return. And yet, even in that moment of grandeur, the details remained intimate. The press of wet grass underfoot, the flicker of parrots across the sky, the salt breeze carrying scents new and sharp, the glimmer of water stretching endlessly westward under the afternoon sun. Spain's ambitions grew from this sight, for if another ocean lay beyond the first, then there were more coasts, more islands, more lands to know, and so the age of exploration deepened again, not in leaps but in steady steps, each voyage adding another piece to the puzzle. In Seville, merchants leaned over maps, their fingers tracing coastlines, their voices low as they wonder how far these seas reached, while in quiet monasteries, monks copied letters describing the wonders of parrots, pearls, and forests so vast they seemed without end, and in small villages, children whisper of oceans larger than any they could imagine, their dreams stirred by stories carried on caravans from ports. Breathe slowly here, and let your mind rest on the image of Balboa's men, weary yet hopeful, making their way back to the Caribbean side, their shirts torn, their feet blistered, yet carrying news that would change how Europe thought of the world. For in their words lay the first true glimpse of another ocean, another horizon, another pathway to dreams. And as we drift toward the close of this chapter, picture the ships that would soon follow, sails billowing as they set out to chart the Pacific, though it would be many years before the immensity was truly understood. And for now, it was enough to know it was there, waiting, shimmering in the sunlight, patient as time itself. When you hear the name Magellan, perhaps you imagine a bold captain striding across a map, drawing lines that circled the world. But the true story is gentler in its unfolding, more human, filled with quiet moments at sea and long days when nothing but water met the eye. And yet those moments mattered as much as the great discoveries, for it was patience and endurance that carried men around the world more than flashes of glory. And so, if you will, let us sit with them not only when they first set sail in 1519, but also during the calm stretches, when ropes creaked soft on the wind and the smell of tar and salt clung to everything, when sailors leaned against a rail and let their minds wander toward the lands left behind. Magellan was Portuguese by birth, yet he sailed under the Spanish crown, a reminder that in those years, loyalty and opportunity did not always follow the same flag, and his dream was vast: to find a western passage to Asia and prove that the riches of the Spice Islands could be reached not only by rounding Africa, but by crossing oceans still unmapped. Picture the fleet of 5 ships: Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion Victoria, and Santiago, leaving Seville and then Sanlúcar, their sails glowing pale in the morning sun, the river water rippling as families on the banks wave farewell, their voices fading as distance grew. For many aboard, it was not courage that carried them, but a mixture of necessity and hope. For some were seeking fortune, others fleeing troubles at home, and all of them knew that what lay ahead was unknown, a horizon filled with both promise and peril. Stay with me here. For the moment, we will slip with them into the Atlantic, feeling the shift of waves beneath the hull, listening to the gulls fall silent as the coast fades, and sensing that peculiar mixture of freedom and dread that comes when land vanishes from sight. The journey was not swift, nor was it filled with constant drama. Instead, it stretched on with rhythm: the steady flapping of sails, the call of the boatswain, the careful rationing of food and water, the endless task of repairing ropes, patching sails, scraping barnacles from the hull, and through all of it, the sea whispered its steady lullaby. Months later, they would find themselves at the mouth of a great estuary, the Rio de la Plata, searching for a strait that might lead westward, and though it offered only disappointment, they lingered there, mapping, observing, watching the tides flow around them. Imagine the lantern light on deck at night, the murmur of men sharing stories, some speaking of homes far away, others dreaming of spices, silks, or simply survival. At last, after storms and losses, they reached the narrow passage we now call the Strait of Magellan, twisting between cold, forbidding shores at the edge of South America. The winds howled there, and yet, within those harsh waters lay the promise of success, a channel leading not to endless dead ends, but to another ocean. And when Magellan emerged from that passage into a calm expanse, he gave a name that remains to this day: the Pacific, the peaceful sea. Breathe with that image. After months of struggle, to emerge into waters so still, so vast, must have felt like a blessing, a relief so profound it echoed in their bones. But the Pacific was deceptive, for though its surface was gentle, its distances were immense. And as the ship sailed on, supplies dwindled, hunger crept in, and men grew weak. Their days filled not with discovery, but with endurance, their nights filled with dreams of food and home. Yet even here, there was beauty. Phosphorescent waters glowing under the stars, the Southern Cross hanging like a lantern in the night sky, the quiet bond between men who shared hardship and wonder alike. In time, after terrible hunger, they reached the islands of Guam and then the Philippines, where Magellan himself would meet his end, not in storms or mutiny, but in conflict upon a shore, his vision carried forward by those who remained. And though he never completed the journey, his fleet did. For the Victoria, 1 ship out of 5, returned to Spain in 1522, its sails ragged, its hull battered, carrying only 18 survivors, yet bearing the proof that the world could be circumnavigated, that seas connected in ways few had imagined, that Earth itself was round and linked by oceans greater than any map had ever shown. Think of that return, a ship limping into harbor, bells tolling, the few men aboard too weary to celebrate, yet quietly aware they had changed history, not with swords or banners, but with endurance and steady hands upon the tiller. And as we let this chapter settle, let yourself drift with that final image: the Victoria rocking gently in port, its ropes creaking softly, its sailors stepping onto stone streets again, their eyes blinking against familiar sunlight, carrying stories that would echo forever after. After Magellan's fleet limped home, with only 1 ship and a handful of gaunt survivors, you might think the story across the Pacific would rest for a while, but the truth is that the vastness of that ocean became not a deterrent but a beckoning mystery, one that would call ship after ship into its glittering expanse. And so in the years that followed, Spain, driven by both faith and fortune, sent new expeditions across those same waters, weaving the first fragile lines of connection between Europe and the islands scattered across the Pacific. And in these journeys, though danger and hunger lingered, There were also long nights of stillness where sailors gazed at stars they had never known, charting constellations that felt like whispers from a new world, and mornings when they woke to landfalls that seemed like mirages, palm trees rising against a horizon of silver blue seas. Imagine it with me. The creak of timbers, the sails snapping in a breeze warm and steady, the slow rocking of the ship that lulled men half into dreams, their faces thin but their eyes bright with wonder when islands appeared, specks of green and endless blue. Stay close, because in a moment you'll see why this matters. The Pacific was not simply a void to cross. It was a world of its own, with currents, winds, and archipelagos that would shape centuries of trade and culture. Sailors learned to listen to the ocean's rhythm. The way swells rose and fell with a pattern that hinted at unseen shores. The way birds appeared long before land, circling the masts as if guiding them onward. These expeditions brought Europeans into contact with peoples who had long thrived upon the Pacific's edges, masters of navigation in their own right. And though the encounters were often clouded by misunderstanding and imbalance, there were moments of quiet exchange, gifts of coconuts and woven mats, glimpses of dances by torchlight on sandy beaches, voices carried across lagoons in languages the sailors could not understand but felt deeply in their hearts. The Pacific, so calm in name, was immense in reality, and voyages across it tested endurance in ways almost unimaginable, weeks stretching into months without fresh food, men growing weary of salted meat and hard biscuit, their lips cracked from thirst, their thoughts drifting toward home even as their ships pressed forward. Yet, even here in hardship, beauty persisted. Shoals of flying fish scattering like sparks across the waves, the luminous glow of plankton at night, the slow rise of the moon painting the sea in pale silver. And when at last land came into sight, perhaps the islands of the Marianas or later, the Philippines again, it was as if the earth itself offered a gentle hand to weary sailors, a place to step ashore and feel sand underfoot, to taste fruit so sweet it seemed to heal their spirits. Spain gradually wove these routes into something more permanent, and from them grew what became known as the Manila galleons, great ships that would, in later decades, carry silver from the mines of the Americas westward, and return laden with silks, spices, and porcelain from Asia, binding together worlds that had once seemed separate. But in these earliest crossings, the sense was not yet of empire, but of wonder, of fragile survival, of men sketching coastlines on parchment by lantern light, uncertain if their lines matched reality, but certain they had glimpsed something vast and eternal. Breathe slowly here, and picture those maps unrolling upon wooden tables in Seville, ink still damp, lines uncertain, the Pacific spreading out like a dream that could not be contained, and know that for all the hardship, the discovery of that ocean's immensity reshaped human imagination more than any gold or spice could. And as we draw this chapter gently close, let yourself drift with the image of the ship alone upon the Pacific at twilight, its sails catching the last glow of sun, its crew leaning silently on the rails, listening to the hush of water against wood, their hearts filled with both exhaustion and awe. And in that quiet, they knew that even if they did not live to see home again, they had touched the edges of something timeless, something that would ripple through history like the waves beneath. There, the Pacific, which had once seemed like an impossible void, slowly became a pathway, and from its waters rose one of the most remarkable arteries of connection the world had ever known. The Manila galleons, those massive ships that sail once or twice each year between Manila in the Philippines and Acapulco in New Spain, across a span of ocean so vast it could take 4 months or more to cross. Yet they became the lifeline of an empire, bearing not only silver and silk, but also stories, ideas, and glimpses of worlds that were now bound together. Let yourself imagine the stillness of a galleon at anchor in Manila Bay, its hull towering, its sails furled, while crates of porcelain, bales of silk, spices in fragrant sacks, and lacquered chests are carried aboard, the sounds of creaking carts and murmured voices filling the humid air, the scent of clove and cinnamon lingering like a whisper of distant forests. The voyage westward toward Mexico was arduous, driven by the trade winds that bore the ships along currents known only through experience, and on board, life was steady and slow. Sailors mending rigging, the captain poring over charts, passengers swaying in hammocks as days blurred into weeks, the sound of waves slapping against with a constant lullaby. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see why this matters. These voyages were not only about commerce, but about creating the first sustained thread linking Asia. the Americas, and Europe, a thread that would shimmer across oceans for 2.5 centuries. Think of the silver, mined in Zacatecas and Potosí, carried on mule trains to Acapulco, shining in a lantern light as it was loaded into galleons bound for Manila, and from there spreading out into Chinese markets, fueling the global economy before such a word even existed. Yet alongside silver and silk came smaller treasures, quiet details of everyday life. Embroidered fans that ended up in Spanish parlors, chocolate and maize that journeyed back across the Pacific to become staples in kitchens far from their origin, and delicate porcelain bowls that found their way to monasteries where monks would sip warm drinks by candlelight, their hands cradling a vessel borne half a world away. On deck during the voyage, sailors would sometimes carve small pieces of ivory or bone to pass the time, or sing softly in the evenings, their voices mingling with the rush of water beneath the hull, creating a rhythm both haunting and soothing. The Pacific itself became a teacher, its winds and currents studied until pilots knew by instinct when to turn northward to catch the Kuroshio current, which would bear them back toward the Americas. Those storms could still scatter even the strongest vessel. Breathe with me here, and imagine the endless blue horizon, the creak of timbers, the canvas sighing as it swelled with wind, the captain's log noting the passing of days, and the subtle reassurance that as long as the stars were overhead, they could find their way home. The Manila galleons were not quick. They did not race, but drifted steadily, their massive hulls heavy with goods. And when at last they reached Acapulco, the entire town would transform, its streets alive with merchants, muleteers, and curious villagers pressing to see the exotic wares unloaded from the holds, fabrics that shimmered in candlelight, spices so aromatic they seemed to perfume the air itself, coins clinking as deals were struck in shaded courtyards. But beyond the market stalls, there was a quiet human story, too, of sailors reunited with families after a month away, of passengers stepping ashore weary but alive, of letters carried across oceans finding their way into trembling hands. And so this rhythm continued, year after year, until the Pacific was no longer a blank mystery, but a bridge, patient and enduring, across which the hum of daily life began to flow. In this way, the age of exploration softened into something gentler, not always conquest or discovery, but connection, slow and steady, the threads of trade weaving tapestries of culture that stretched further than anyone had imagined. And as you let your breath slow, picture the galleon again, sails unfurling as dawn rose over Manila Bay, the ship gliding into open water, its course steady, its crew silent with expectation, knowing that the months ahead would test them, but also knowing that when they arrived, they would carry not just goods, but the weight of two worlds balanced on the swell of the Pacific Ocean. If you lean closer with me now, we can slip quietly into the slower rhythm of life that the Manila galleons created, not in grand gestures or sudden revelations, but in the quiet transformations of households, villages, and ports scattered across both sides of the Pacific. For the age of exploration was not always about sails unfurling or storms endured, but about how the world began to seep into daily life, thread by thread, until people far from the sea tasted and touched things that had once seemed unimaginable. Imagine, for instance, a villager in Oaxaca holding a piece of blue and white porcelain, its glaze smooth, the painted designs delicate and flowing, a vessel that had begun its journey in kills of Jingdezhen, carried across Chinese rivers, loaded into the hull of the galleon, and borne across an ocean so wide that many who set sail upon it never returned, and yet here in her hands, it was simply a bowl to hold fruit or water, its exotic journey hidden within its quiet usefulness. In Spain, too, in dimly lit kitchens, women stirred chocolate brought from the New World, blending it with sugar carried from plantations, while outside their windows, men wore doublets stitched with silk thread spun by worms in faraway mulberry groves. Stay with me here, because in a moment you'll see how profound this was. Exploration was not only about maps expanding, it was about daily routines deepening, becoming richer, becoming layered with textures from continents that had once been isolated. A merchant in Seville might sip tea brought from Asia, while his wife's fan, painted with flowers, had come across the Pacific. A child might hear stories of parrots and pineapples from sailors returning to Acapulco, stories that planted dreams in his imagination as surely as seeds in soil. And meanwhile, across the sea in Manila, Chinese merchants bargained in narrow streets, their goods stacked high in baskets, while Filipino fishermen, their boats pulled onto shore, looked at the towering Spanish galleons with a mixture of awe and routine, for by then their presence had become seasonal, like the monsoon winds. On the ships themselves, life remained steady and difficult, yet full of small comforts. Hammocks swaying gently with the swell, the smell of salted fish and rice cooking in iron pots, the soft scrape of dice across a wooden board as sailors played to pass long hours, the sound of prayers whisper at night as stars glittered above. In these details, the great age softened, became human, became something you could almost feel in your own home, as if across centuries you too could run your fingers along porcelain or sip a drink once unknown to your ancestors, and feel connected to that vast humming network that carried not only goods but also dreams. Breathe gently here and picture the mule trains that wound through Mexican mountains, silver-strapped in leather bags clinking with every step, their bells ringing faintly in the clear air, while in Manila, crates of silk were stacked on wooden piers, their colors shimmering in candlelight, waiting to be heaved aboard. None of this was quick, none of it sudden. It was a pulse, like a heartbeat, slow but steady, across which cultures merged quietly, without fanfare, until the very fabric of daily life was different, richer, layered with distant echoes. And as you let this chapter settle into you, picture a galleon at night upon the Pacific, lanterns swaying with the roll of the sea, sailors wrapped in blankets against the wind, their eyes closing to the rhythm of waves, carry with them not only goods but the subtle promise of a world already becoming one. There is a certain hush that falls over the ocean when weeks stretch into months and the horizon remains unbroken, a hush that the sailors of the Manila galleons came to know well, for the Pacific, despite its name, was not always peaceful in weather, but in its immensity it imposed a calm, a steady patience that slowed time itself. And it is into this silence we will step together now, drifting with them as they cross that immense distance. Imagine the deck underfoot, sun-bleached, sticky with salt, the sound of timbers creaking as the ship leaned into swells, the sails taut but not hurried, for these were no racing vessels but lumbering giants, heavy with cargo, steady as beasts of burden, their pace dictated by wind and current. Men awoke at dawn, their eyes stinging from salt air, and went about their duties with quiet regularity, mending ropes, scrubbing decks, hauling water from barrels. The rhythm of work is repetitive as the waves themselves, and yet within that repetition, a strange kind of comfort was found. Stay with me here, for in a moment you will see how the stillness mattered as much as the storms. At night, under stars so bright they seemed near enough to touch, men lay on deck wrapped in rough blankets, gazing upward, tracing patterns not yet named in their charts, whispering prayers, or simply letting their thoughts wander across oceans they could not yet fathom. Hunger was a constant companion. Rations of salted meat and hard biscuit grew stale and meager, fresh water soured. Yet sometimes a shoal of flying fish would leap across the bow, their bodies glittering like sparks, and sailors would catch them, roast them quickly, and eat with gratitude that bordered on reverence. Imagine, too, the smell of tar as barrels were patched, the slow scrape of barnacles from the hull when seas were calm enough to risk men overboard on ropes, the soft clatter of dice or carved bone as games passed the long hours. And within this monotony came beauty. The sight of dolphins racing alongside the bow, the glow of phosphorescent plankton turning the wake into a river of stars, the rise of the moon casting silver pathways across water, so smooth it seemed to mirror the heavens. It is easy to think of exploration as discovery in sudden bursts, but here, in the long, quiet crossings, exploration meant endurance, and endurance meant finding meaning in the smallest of details, the rustle of canvas, the whisper of prayer, the faint laughter of men sharing stories of home. Picture the hammock swaying in the hold, sailors dreaming of mountains and meadows far away, even as the ocean carried them farther from all they had known, their dreams mingling with the creak of wood and the sigh of waves. Days bled into one another until calendars seemed meaningless, and only the sun's rise and fall marked time. And yet, within that timelessness, bonds grew strong, for survival depended not on one man alone but on all, each hand a part of the living rhythm of the ship. Breathe gently with me now, and imagine how those long days shaped them, not only hardened by hunger, but softened by awe, for even in hardship the ocean offered a strange gift, the chance to witness the immensity of the world, to feel the smallness of the self against horizons unending, and in that smallness, perhaps, a kind of peace. And when at last land was sighted, after months of blue upon blue, the sight of green hills or sandy shores rising from the sea was not merely relief, It was rebirth, the return of color, scent, and texture to lives that had become monotone. Think of the first coconut cracked open, sweet water spilling onto thirsty lips, or the first fruit pressed between teeth, juices running down chins, laughter erupting from men who had forgotten what sweetness was. These moments, though fleeting, stitched meaning into the endless cloth of the voyage, reminders that beyond endurance lay wonder, and beyond silence lay song. And as you let this chapter close, picture the ship at twilight, lanterns glowing dimly, the horizon awash of violet and rose, the sails sighing as they fill with wind, and the men aboard weary but alive, cradled by the hush of the Pacific, their thoughts drifting like yours now, steady, safe, and unhurried across the sea of dreams. When the galleons or smaller caravels finally drifted close to islands after months of ocean, the first sight was almost dreamlike, palm fronds swaying in breezes that carried scents of flowers and smoke, lagoons glowing turquoise in the sunlight, and villages hidden just beyond the tree line, their huts raised on stilts or nestled among the foliage. And for the sailors, these visions seemed like salvation, like stepping into a painting after endless blue horizons. Yet for the islanders, the sight of towering ships with sails like clouds must have seemed just as strange. And so the earliest encounters between explorers and Pacific peoples were framed not by conquest, but by cautious curiosity. Imagine for a moment the beach at dawn, the sand cool underfoot, as canoes glided over quiet water, their paddles dipping rhythmically. Men and women dressed in woven cloth watching silently as the foreign vessel bobbed at anchor, and on deck, sailors leaned on the rail, whispering to one another, their hearts caught between wonder and fear. Stay close here, because in a moment you'll feel why these encounters mattered. They were the first bridges between worlds separated for millennia, and though later history would bring shadows of exploitation and imbalance, in these earliest hours there was often a gentleness, an exchange of food, water, and gifts, gestures that spoke across languages unshared. Sailors would offer beads or trinkets, and in return they might receive coconuts, bananas, or roasted fish, and the first taste of fresh fruit after months of salted rations was not only nourishment but joy, an almost sacred experience. Think of the laughter that might ripple when a simple misunderstanding was resolved with gestures, the cautious smiles breaking into warmth, the recognition that despite differences in skin, speech, or dress, the beating of hearts was the same. At night, under the glow of torches, there might be singing on the shore, voices rising in harmony, the crackle of fire sending sparks into the darkness, while from the deck sailors listened, lulled by sounds both strange and comforting, as if the sea itself were singing back to them. These encounters did not erase the hardships of the voyage, but they softened them, reminding weary men that the world was filled not only with emptiness but with community, with beauty, with ways of living that had thrived long before their arrival. Picture an islander placing a shell necklace around the neck of a sailor, the gesture simple, the meaning profound, or a sailor sharing a knife in return, the exchange shimmering like a thread woven between two worlds. And while later records would speak of misunderstandings, conflicts, and losses, the quieter truth of those early meetings is that they also carried tenderness, the recognition of shared humanity across distance once thought uncrossable. Breathe slowly here, and imagine yourself on that beach, hearing the surf whisper, smelling wood smoke, watching as strangers smiled at one another and broke bread together, and feel how such moments, fragile and fleeting, carried more weight than all the maps and treaties, for they were the seeds of connection, the first breaths of a global world still young. And as this chapter drifts to its close, let yourself rest with the image of canoes and galleons rocking side by side in the shallows, lanterns glowing faintly on decks, torches flickering onshore and between them, the soft hum of voices, cautious at first, then warmer, weaving across the water like lullabies that carried hope into the vastness of night. When explorers returned from their Pacific crossings, they brought not only spices, silks, or silver, but something less tangible and perhaps more enduring. Their maps and journals, those fragile sheets of parchment covered in ink and salt-stained notes, sketches of coastlines drawn by lantern light on rocking decks, words hurriedly recorded before storms swept across the page. And these records, more than any treasure, reshaped the imagination of Europe. Picture a dim study in Seville or Lisbon, a cartographer leaning over a wide wooden table, spreading out a worn logbook, his lamp flickering as he traced with quill the outline of an island described by a sailor who had glimpsed it only for a moment at dawn. The cartographer might hesitate, frown, then add a dotted line, a shape uncertain, and in that moment, he expanded the known world, not with certainty but with possibility. Stay close here, because in a moment you'll feel how powerful this was. A map was more than a drawing. It was a promise, a whisper that beyond the horizon lay something waiting. And so, even when sailors had only half seen a shore or confused one bay for another, their words carried weight, and their sketches rippled across Europe's understanding. In monasteries, scribes copied these journals carefully, their ink steady on vellum, so that others could read of parrots whose feathers shimmered like jewels, of coconuts that poured sweet water, of stars arranged in patterns no one had charted before, and each line fed the hunger for knowledge that pulsed through the Renaissance. Imagine children crowding around a traveler returned from Manila, their eyes wide as he described seas that stretched farther than months could measure, or a merchant in Antwerp rolling out a new map, his finger tracing the arc of the galleon's course, his imagination alight with possibilities. These records were not always precise. Some coastlines were misplaced, some islands doubled or invented, and yet that did not matter, for in their imperfections lay curiosity, the fuel that drove men to launch new voyages, to correct, to confirm, to see for themselves. Breathe gently here, and imagine yourself unfolding a great map by candlelight, the paper crackling softly, the ink glowing brown to flame, the lines meandering across oceans, and feel the thrill that Europeans must have felt when they realized the world was not shrinking but expanding, that the blank spaces were being filled with names, colors, and stories. Journals also carried personal details, quiet human truths, the fear of hunger, the relief of landfall, the beauty of phosphorescent seas, the songs sung by islanders under moonlight, the laughter of sailors when they tasted fresh fruit after months of salted rations. These details softened the vast distances, making them intimate, making the Pacific less an abstract void and more a place of lived experience, a place of wonder and hardship woven together. In the libraries of noblemen, such journals were read aloud, and in taverns, sailors retold them with embellishment, so that tales spread even to those who would never see the sea. And as these stories flowed across Europe, they shifted not only commerce and ambition, but the imagination of an age that was already restless, hungry for knowledge, and ready to believe that the world, though immense, could be known. Let your breath slow here, and picture the moment a young artist, hearing of these distant islands, sketches a palm tree he has never seen, guided only by words, or a mathematician, poring over reports of stars in the southern hemisphere, recalibrates his understanding of the heavens. This was a quiet legacy of exploration, not only in riches, but in thought, in maps that were both accurate and dreamlike, in journals that blended fact and wonder. And as this chapter draws to a gentle close, hold in your mind the image of a sailor's logbook lying open on a table, its pages curling at the edges, its words simple and tired, yet carry within them the immensity of the Pacific, and beyond the lamp's glow, the faint whisper of rain against shutters, as if reminding the listener that every great ocean begins with small ripples. When we think of the age of exploration, we often picture the ships, the sails, the navigators, and the maps, yet another quieter ripple spread across Europe during these years, something less tangible but no less transformative, the way stories, objects, and images from distant lands filtered into art, literature, and imagination of ordinary people, shaping the Renaissance itself into a more curious and outward-looking age. Picture yourself in a workshop in Florence, late at night, the glow of small oil lamps off against plaster walls, a young painter leaning close to a sketchbook, his hands still dusty with chalk, as he copies the strange curved shape of fruit described by a traveler returning from Hispaniola, a pineapple. It spikes him like anything he has ever seen before. He has never touched one, never smelled its sweetness, yet through words and rough sketches passed from sailor to scholar, from scholar to artist, the fruit enters his imagination, and soon it may appear painted into the background of Madonna or as a detail on a nobleman's table. Stay with me here, for in a moment you'll see why this matters. The Renaissance, often remembered for rediscovering classical antiquity, also absorbed these living stories of the world beyond Europe, weaving them quietly into the threads of its art and thought. Writers, too, found themselves stirred by these tales. A poet in Lisbon might sit by his window, listening to the river tide slap against stone, and in his verses he blends the myth of Odysseus with the real accounts of Vasco da Gama, imagining gods of sea bending their will around men in fragile caravels, and in doing so, He helps his readers place their present age within the great chain of human adventure. This was not just embellishment. It was a way of making sense of a world that suddenly felt larger, mysterious, but also accessible. And in quieter corners of Europe, where books reached fewer hands, stories spread by word of mouth, embroidered with each telling. Fishermen describing whales so vast that their backs looked like islands, merchants boasting of silks dyed in colors no one had ever seen, women whispering of spices that could change the taste of bread into something almost divine. These tales settled into minds not as curiosities but as seeds, inspiring dreams in children, pushing them toward learning, urging them to believe that somewhere beyond the horizon lay marvels waiting to be known. Breathe slowly with me, and imagine a candlelit library, the hush of pages turning, scholars debating how to reconcile Aristotle's descriptions of the earth with the new accounts pouring in from the Indies, wondering how so much of the world had remained unseen, and asking quietly, almost reverently, what other truths still waited to be found. The exchange was not only intellectual, it was material, too. Cabinets of curiosities began to appear in the homes of wealthy collectors, filled with shells from the Caribbean, feathers from the Amazon, fragments of porcelain from China. Guests would gather around these cabinets as if around a fire, murmuring in awe, touching lightly, holding each object as though it carried a secret. And indeed it did, for each piece bore witness to a journey across oceans, storms, and months of uncertainty. Art responded by weaving these objects into its fabric. Tapestries showing parrots perched on vines, engravings of exotic plants, altarpieces where donors insisted on being painted with globes or compasses in hand, as if to link their piety with worldly awareness. Even music felt the ripple. Drums, flutes, and stringed instruments from Africa and Asia found their way into European courts, altering rhythms and melodies in subtle ways that most listeners never traced back to ships, but that enriched the soundscape nonetheless. Let your breath deepen here, because the thought itself is calming. Every note, every stroke, every word carried faint echoes of the wider world. And so the Renaissance did not only look backward to Greece and Rome, but outward to the new horizons revealed by exploration. Think of the painter Albrecht Dürer sketching a rhinoceros he had never seen, guided only by descriptions, his image both strange and compelling, becoming the standard reference for decades. Or Shakespeare's plays, filled with passing mentions of the Indies, the Americas, and strange spices, showing how deeply the presence of distant lands had settled into the imagination of even those who never left England. Stay with me. These are the details that reveal how imagination and reality wove together. And in a moment you will sense how this gentle merging changed not only culture, but the way Europeans understood themselves. For with every pineapple painted, every feather admired, every map unfurled in a playhouse, Europe was quietly telling itself that it was not isolated, not bounded, but part of something vast and interconnected, a truth that would echo far beyond the age itself. And yet, there was another dimension worth pausing on. The stories brought back by sailors were often softened or reshaped to fit expectations, blending reality with myth. An island glimpsed in the haze might become a paradise in retelling, its inhabitants described as noble and free of greed, echoing Europe's own dreams of innocence. Or, conversely, they might be painted as dangerous and strange, reinforcing fears and justifying conquest. This duality, wonder and fear, admiration and control, slipped quietly into the cultural memory, affecting not just politics but also art, literature, and even philosophy. As you rest here, let yourself notice how gentle this process was, how gradual, like ink seeping slowly into parchment, staining but also preserving, until Europe's imagination was soaked with visions of distant places. It meant that by the late 16th century, a person in Venice or Paris might have never left their city, yet lived surrounded by signs of a world they could only dream of, their cups painted with Chinese motifs, their spices from Sumatra, their stories filled with images from across the seas. And all of this, every painting, every poem, every carved cabinet, every whispered tale, was part of the cultural legacy of the age of exploration, a legacy that still lingers in our museums, our books, and even in the fruits we eat without thinking of their journeys. Now, close your eyes for a moment, breathe in, and imagine standing in a Renaissance gallery, the floor cool beneath your feet, the walls adorned with canvases that hold both the sacred and the worldly. And in the silence, you can almost hear the echoes of waves, the hush of sails, the quiet awe of discovery, reminding you that history, like sleep, is a journey where each detail gently carries you further into wonder. As the 16th century drifted deeper into its unfolding, the quiet revolution of exploration began to seep into the sciences, not in sudden bursts of invention, but in steady ripples. Like circles widening across a still pond after a stone is dropped, each ripple touching new minds, new disciplines, and new ways of seeing the world. Navigation, once guided largely by instinct and coastal familiarity, grew into something more precise, more mathematical, thanks to the charts, logs, and celestial observations that explorers carried home. Picture a ship at sea, the stars overhead like endless lanterns, a sailor standing with an astrolabe in hand. The metal chilled against the skin, measuring the angle of Polaris above the horizon, noting carefully the numbers on a wax slate before passing them to the captain, who, in his small cabin, plots their position with trembling ink lines by candlelight. This practice, repeated night after night, built a discipline, and soon European scholars began to collect these measurements, comparing them, refining them, slowly constructing new systems that made navigation less guesswork and more science. Stay with me here, because in a moment you'll sense how profound this shift was. It wasn't only about getting ships safely across oceans, though that mattered immensely. It was about creating a new relationship between humankind and the heavens, a sense that the stars were not just ornaments but guides, that the sky itself was a map waiting to be read. Astronomy blossomed in this climate. Observations from the southern hemisphere astonished scholars. Constellations unknown to the ancients, stars never described by Ptolemy, patterns that shifted the sense of balance in the cosmos. Sailors described the Southern Cross glowing like a lantern above unfamiliar seas. And when they brought these reports home, astronomers recalibrated their charts, adjusting their understanding of the universe with each returning voyage. Breathe softly with me, for there is something soothing in this image. Men on tiny decks, rocked by waves, gazing upward at infinite stars, while men in cloister studies leaned over parchment, trying to connect those very same dots into systems of knowledge, each group separated by oceans but joined by curiosity. Medicine, too, felt the ripple. Herbs and remedies carried from the Americas, Africa, and Asia found their way into European apothecaries. Quinine, drawn from the bark of trees in Peru, offered relief against fevers, though its full potential would not be realized until centuries later. Strange roots, powders, and seeds appeared in glass jars behind wooden counters, and physicians experimented cautiously, adding these novelties to their repertory, expanding what was possible in healing. The knowledge of indigenous peoples, though often filtered through layers of misunderstanding, nonetheless broadened the scope of European medicine, teaching doctors to consider new plants, new balances, new methods of care. Imagine a dim shop in Venice, the air rich with the scent of cinnamon, cloves, and dried leaves, a physician carefully grinding a substance that had traveled half the globe, whispering to himself of its rumored power, and offering it to a patient as a gentle hope. Stay with me, because in a moment we'll notice another current. Mathematics itself, sharpened by the needs of navigation, grew richer. Tables of logarithms, calculations of longitude and latitude, refinements of geometry. These were not abstract puzzles but urgent necessities, born from the demand to know where a ship was and where it was going. Scholars such as Regiomontanus and later Kepler drew on the data of navigators, testing theories against the stubborn realities of sea voyages. And slowly, gently, this interplay between practice and theory reshaped the very structure of knowledge in Europe, so that exploration was no longer just about physical journeys, but about intellectual voyages into uncharted territories of thought. Let your breath deepen here, for in this fusion of sea and sky, of body and book, lies the calm beauty of the Renaissance spirit. Curiosity flowed like a quiet river, nourishing every field it touched. Even cartography, which might seem a mere craft, became a science. The Mercator projection, developed in the mid-16th century, transformed maps into tools of navigation, not just images. The curved earth could be translated onto flat parchment in a way that preserved bearings, allowing sailors to plot straight lines across oceans. To imagine the first time a captain traced a ruler across such a map, confident that the line would carry him truly across months of sea, is to glimpse a new confidence in human reason. This confidence fed back into philosophy. 2. As thinkers began to argue that observation, record, and careful reasoning could unlock the mysteries of the world, not reliance on tradition alone. And so the journals of sailors, once dismissed as a chatter of common men, became precious evidence, data to be sifted, compared, and preserved. Let's pause here and imagine the hush of a university hall, the crackle of fire, the murmur of students as a professor unrolls a map brought from overseas, pointing with his finger to a coastline no ancient had described, and asking his pupils to consider what this meant for the knowledge they had inherited. In that quiet, in that flicker of firelight, a seed of the scientific revolution was being sown. Breathe calmly again, and notice how all of this unfolded without noise or drama, like dawn spreading light across a sleeping city. The age of exploration did not shout its lessons. It whispered them, carried on parchment and in jars, in small instruments of brass, in notebooks filled with careful numbers. And slowly, gently, Europe began to change not just its boundaries, but its very way of thinking, shifting from reliance on what was said to trust in what could be seen, measured, tested. This was a soft but steady gift of exploration. Not only lands, not only riches, but a method, a mindset, a way of leaning closer to the world and listening to what it offered. As this chapter draws toward its close, picture yourself in a quiet observatory on a hill, the air cool, the stars bright, a scholar lifting his eye to a lens of ground glass, adjusting it with careful fingers, his heart calm but steady, knowing that the heavens themselves could be read more clearly now because sailors adventure cross seas. And in the stillness, feel how this truth applies even now. That exploration, in all its forms, begins not with conquest or noise, but with a simple act of looking closely, writing faithfully, and trusting that knowledge, like a tide, will carry us gently forward. When you think of the great voyages of exploration, it is easy to picture maps, discoveries, and the names of captains that fill the pages of history. But behind those broad strokes was a hum of daily life aboard the ships themselves, a quieter history of men who rose each morning to the same creaking timbers, the same salted air, and the same steady rhythm of work and waiting. And to understand the age of exploration fully, you must also drift gently into that world of ordinary routine, because it is in the sound of footsteps on wooden decks, the smell of tar and rope, and the soft thrum of waves against hulls that the story truly lives. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in a cramped berth, the air heavy with damp and the scent of sweat and salted meat, hearing the soft groans of the vessel as it rocks, and above, the faint call of the boatswain summoning the watch to their posts. You climb into the cool air, the sea stretching endless in every direction, and the faint glow of starlight overhead guiding the last of the night watch as they hand over their duties. Stay close here, because in a moment you will feel the rhythm that made these journeys not just possible but survivable. Bells mark the passing of time. Every 4 hours a change of watch, men moving in practiced silence to their tasks, trimming sails, coiling ropes, checking rigging, while others set to quieter labors, scrubbing decks with sand to keep them clean, pumping water from the bilges, stirring cauldrons in the galley. Meals were plain yet precious. Hardtack that cracked against the teeth, salted beef that needed soaking, dried peas boiled into thick stews, and the occasional treat of fish caught with lines trailed from the stern, the taste of freshness almost shocking after weeks of sameness. And yet, even here, there were small comforts, rituals that made the hardship bearable. Men would carve its wood into trinkets, mend their garments with care, hum old songs that drifted up like prayers, soft and steady. Life aboard was not without dangers, of course, but we will not dwell on them harshly, for this is a story meant to soothe, and so instead we focus on resilience. The way sailors created a kind of floating community in the middle of the ocean, where friendships formed as naturally as the tides, where laughter might rise suddenly during a card game or while sharing stories from home, each tale embroidered and stretched with imagination to pass the long hours. Stay with me, because in another breath you will see the beauty of this rhythm. Evenings when the sky turned gold, men would gather along the rail, staring at the horizon as if searching for a glimpse of land, though they knew it was weeks away, their silence companionable, their hearts steady by the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. Nights held their own rituals too. Some would lie on deck with eyes to the stars, tracing constellations, whispering names like Orion or the Great Bear, while others huddled near lanterns, patching sails or writing letters they could not yet send, words scratched in cramped hands on scraps of paper. And in these moments, beneath the hush of waves, there was peace, a rhythm almost like breathing, in and out, the ship itself a cradle rocked by the sea. Think also of the music. Fiddles when one could be spared, drums beaten from barrels, pipes carved from bone, melodies rising and falling, songs of home, songs of longing, and work songs timed to the pulling of ropes, voices blending into chants that made labor lighter, their cadence rolling like the ocean itself. Daily life also included prayer, for most voyages carried a chaplain or at least a memory of faith. Men would gather on Sundays, their hats in hand, as a psalm was read, the words mingling with the cries of gulls if they were near land or the endless wind if they were not. And this practice reminded them that they were never entirely alone, that even in the emptiest seas they were connected to something eternal. Let us linger here, for in these images you can feel the gentleness that balanced the harshness, the humanity that softened the uncertainty. In the middle of great ventures that reshaped the world, these men still needed to eat, to sleep, to sing, to laugh, to dream, and their dreams, though carried far across oceans, were not so different from yours. The longing for warmth, the thought of a loved one, the comfort of a hearth. Stay with me, and imagine how at night, when most had gone below, a lone figure might stand on deck, wrapped in a cloak, breathing the salt air, staring at a moonlit horizon, his mind quiet, his heart full, sensing the enormity of the sea and yet finding calm in its endlessness. These moments of reflection, repeated thousands of times across thousands of miles, were the unseen foundation of exploration, for they gave men the strength to endure, to hope, to sail farther than anyone had before. And so, daily life aboard ship was not just hardship. It was also a rhythm, a lullaby of bells, waves, wind, and song that carried them gently, day after day, into the unknown and carried us, centuries later, into a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, to search, to endure, to dream upon the water. After endless months upon restless seas, the first glimpse of a distant coastline was like a dream slipping gently into focus, a hazy line that grew from cloud into mountains, from shadow into forest, from forest into the glint of rivers and shores. And though the men aboard ships had spoken of landfall, had imagined it, had prayed for it in their weary hearts, nothing could quite match the quiet that spread across the deck when the horizon revealed something solid after so long adrift. And you can almost hear the breath they must have drawn in, sharp yet hushed, as if afraid that too loud a sound might dissolve the vision. Stay with me here, because this moment of arrival carried more than relief. It was layered with wonder, curiosity, and the gentle strangeness of stepping into a world that seemed familiar in its earth and trees, yet entirely new in its shapes, scents, and colors. Picture the shoreline at dawn, mist rising from the water, birds wheeling overhead with cries unknown to European ears, the air rich with fragrance of blossoms unseen before, and along the beach, perhaps, footprints where locals had passed at dawn, the prints already filling with tide. Sailors lean over the rail, shading their eyes, pointing to palm groves or cliffs, whispering to one another, their voices hushed with reverence, and captains ordered sails trimmed, anchors lowered, every gesture careful, every word measured, for they knew they were not only reaching land but crossing into lives and histories already in motion. When small boats were lowered, their wooden sides groaning, and men rowed toward the beach, the splash of oars seemed louder than it should, echoing across the quiet, and each man's heart beat quickly, not with fear exactly, but with the weight of knowing he was part of a moment larger than himself. And when they stepped onto the sand, their boots sinking slightly, they bent to touch the ground, some crossing themselves, some scooping handfuls of soil to smell, others merely standing still, listening to hum of insects, the whisper of wind in trees, the music of a place that had always been here, waiting long before they came. Breathe slowly here, and feel the gentleness in this scene. Men who had eaten salted beef and hard biscuits for months now staring in disbelief at fruits that hung ripe within reach, their colors like jewels, their taste so sweet it almost hurt, and they laughed quietly, juice dripping down their chins, unable to believe such abundance. They filled casks with fresh water from streams, the coldness shocking against their tongues, and they bathed in it, washing away salt crusted on their skin, their laughter carrying over the waves like birdsong. But alongside the joy was a softer, heavier note, the awareness that they were strangers, that eyes might be watching from the forest edge. And indeed, often there were, local inhabitants, curious but cautious, sometimes remained hidden, sometimes approached. Their presence fell in a rustle of leaves, a distant voice, or a sudden appearance along the shore. The first exchanges were tentative, shaped by gestures more than words, by offerings more than declarations. A sailor might hold out a bead, and in return receive a piece of fruit. A captain might extend a hand, and in return see a smile, cautious but real. These encounters were fragile, like threads spun across vast gulfs, and while history would later record moments of tension, of missteps and loss, in these earliest hours it was often a hushed recognition, a quiet respect, a sense that here, on this shore, the world was wide enough for all. Stay close, because in another moment you will see how arrival was not only about geography but about imagination. The plants and animal sailors saw defy what they had known. Parrots with feathers blazing green and red, monkeys darting through branches, trees taller than church towers, and flowers opening with petals like fire. Men gasped softly, their voices hushed as if they had stepped into Eden, and some plucked leaves to press between the pages of journals, while others stood in silence, overwhelmed. The scholars aboard, if there were any, scribbled notes furiously, trying to capture shapes, smells, sounds, though words failed them. Even the simplest things, a butterfly landing on a sailor's hand, a lizard scurrying over stones, seemed miraculous, reminders that the world was larger, richer, more intricate than they had ever believed. And yet, amid the marvel, the rhythm of daily duty returned. Camps were set up with care, fires kindled, watch posted, tents raised, because exploration, however wondrous, was also practical. Men needed rest, food, safety. But in the evenings, when the day's work was done, they would gather around small fires, stare into the glow, listening to the forest around them. The night filled with calls they had never heard before, and some would feel uneasy, while others would feel strangely at peace, lulled by the lullaby of crickets, frogs, and the soft crash of waves. Think of one sailor lying back in the sand, staring at the stars above, stars he had seen every night at sea, yet somehow different here, framed by palm fronds and mountain ridges. And he whispered to himself that the world was endless, and in that endlessness he found not fear but calm. These moments of arrival, repeated across coasts of Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Pacific Islands, shaped the story of exploration more than any battle or treaty, for they were the moments when hearts opened, when men realized they were stepping into a living world, not empty maps. And though their presence would alter it, they could not escape the wonder of first sight. As this chapter eases toward its close, let yourself rest in that moment. A campfire flickering on a foreign beach, shadows dancing against sails pulled ashore, men whispering softly, fruits and fresh water beside them, the vast unknown forest behind, the endless sea at their backs, and above, stars glimmering like old friends, steady and reassuring, reminding them that even in strangeness, there was always something familiar to hold on to. When strangers first stood face to face on the shores of discovery, words failed them, and yet curiously, the absence of shared speech did not silence them, for human beings, when drawn together, find other ways to bridge the distance. And in these early encounters between explorers and the people whose lands they reached, language began not with sentences, but with gestures, with tone, with rhythm, with the offering of small objects and the raising of open palms, and though later histories will be full of miscommunications and tragedies, in the quiet beginnings there was often a gentler dance, one of curiosity wrapped in patience. Imagine for a moment a small circle on a beach, sailors standing awkwardly in stiff coats, islanders or villagers standing opposite in garments woven of local fibers, the two groups shifting, watching, trying to guess intent. One sailor reaches slowly into his pouch and draws out a bead of glass, holding it in the sun until it glimmers, then stepping forward with lowered head and extending it outward. An islander tilts his head, studies the object, takes it, then in turn offers a piece of fruit or a carved shell. The exchange is sealed not with words, but with a smile, with laughter that bubbles nervously and then warmly. And though neither understands the other's tongue, something essential is understood. Stay close here, because the beauty of this lies not in grand gestures, but in small ones. The way a hand touches a heart to signify gratitude, the way eyes soften when trust grows, the way children, less burdened by caution, may giggle and step forward first, unafraid to mimic the stranger's movements. Slowly, sounds emerge, names spoken aloud, repeated clumsily, then laughed at, then tried again, until syllables fall more easily. Explorers noted these attempts in journals, writing lists of words, their spellings inconsistent but earnest, while locals tested European words, bending their mouths around unfamiliar sounds, sometimes reshaping them entirely, turning them into something new. And so language grew between them not as a structure, but as a garden, patchy, uneven, yet alive, sprouting here and there with shared meaning. Music helped, too, for song carries where words stumble. Sailors might sing as they worked, and locals, hearing the rhythm, would echo or respond with their own melodies, a call and answer across cultures. Instruments appeared, drums, flutes, perhaps a fiddle carried aboard, and soon the shore was alive with sound, voices weaving together in a tapestry richer than speech alone. In such moments, both sides may have felt something timeless, that humans, despite oceans and centuries apart, shared the same impulse to sing, to dance, to laugh together under the stars. Breathe gently with me, for this image is tender, a sailor showing a child how to blow into a pipe, the child's laughter ringing like bells when the sound bursts forth, an islander teaching a visitor the beat of a drum, his hands guiding the rhythm until the stranger joins confidently, the two smiling, heads nodding, no translation required. Stories were also shared, though imperfectly. An elder might gesture toward the horizon, drawing shapes in sand to describe journeys or ancestors, while a captain, in turn, might sketch a rough outline of his homeland, pointing and speaking softly, his words incomprehensible but his tone conveying longing. These sketches and gestures were not precise, but they conveyed essence, that all peoples and memories had pasts, had places they cherished. Stay with me, because here lies the soft revelation. Communication is not only about the exchange of accurate information, it is about the willingness to reach, to try, to show openness. And when the explorers and the locals looked at one another in silence after such exchanges, often there was a quiet smile, an acknowledgement that even if the words were unclear, the intent was clear. You are human, and so am I, and in that recognition there is peace. The journals of sailors record words learned, fish, water, friend, food, written in cramped ink, lists growing day by day, and these were more than notes. They were proof of connection, fragile yet real. At times, misunderstandings led to tension. A gesture meant as friendship might be misread. A gift not valued might cause offense. But just as often, patience smoothed the moment. A laugh, a repeated motion, an exaggerated demonstration could clarify, and slowly trust deepened. At night, around shared fires, communication became simpler still. Food was passed hand to hand, warmth shared, songs hummed, dances performed. And though no single sentence was fully understood, the meaning was carried in the glow of the flames and the rhythm of footsteps on the earth. Picture this. A beach lit with fire, explorers seated cross-legged, islanders moving gracefully in a circle, their shadows tall against the night, drums steady, voices rising and falling, while sailors clap along, their hands awkward but eager, their eyes wide with admiration. For a few hours, the boundaries of language dissolve, and what remains is communion. Breathe deeply here, and sense how this matters. The age of exploration is remembered from maps and conquests, but beneath those grand narratives lie moments like these, moments of fragile humanity, where people separated by ocean share fruit, song, laughter, and silence, weaving together threads that no storm could erase. And as the night deepens, imagine one sailor looking up at the stars, hearing an islander sing softly beside him, and realizing that though they cannot speak to one another in words, they are nonetheless speaking in the oldest language of all, presence, kindness, and shared wonder beneath the same sky. In the soft unfolding of time after first encounters, when the initial awe of meeting gave way to familiarity, a slower rhythm began to take shape, one of exchange, of coexistence, of learning how to live, if only for a while, side by side. And in this rhythm the story of exploration softened from sails and compasses into food shared, customs blended, and quiet routines established at the edge of oceans. Picture the beach now not as a stage for first contact, but as a place of daily crossing, with canoes and longboats moving steadily back and forth, carrying bundles of fruit, jars of water, coils of rope, planks of wood, even laughter itself as voices called across the surf. Sailors, once strangers, now grew accustomed to the sight of islanders or villagers approaching, their paddles dipping in unison, their presence no longer startling but expected, welcomed. And on shore beneath palm trees or by riverbanks, small markets of sorts emerged, sailors laying out beads, iron nails, knives, and bolts of cloth, while locals displayed coconuts, bananas, sweet roots, dried fish, or carved ornaments, each side studying the goods, pointing, nodding, smiling, slowly creating a language of trade that was less about words and about trust. Stay with me here, because in a moment you will sense how these exchanges rippled outward. They were not only about sustenance for voyages, but about reshaping worlds. When sailors tasted fruits or roots unknown in Europe, they carried those flavors home, describing them in journals with clumsy words. Sweet like honey, tart like apples, unlike anything known. And when locals received iron nails or knives, their daily tasks changed subtly, tools reshaping rhythms of labor. At night, when the fires glowed, there were other kinds of exchanges, more intangible. Stories told with gestures, songs shared, dances learned. Sailors might try the steps of a circle dance, stumbling, laughing, while islanders clapped in encouragement. And in return, perhaps a shanty was sung, its rhythm joined by drums, its chorus echoed until it became something new, a blend of voices neither entirely European nor entirely local. Think also the ways food itself bound them together. Sailors tasting roasted breadfruit, savoring its warmth, islanders sampling the hard biscuit sailors softened in broth, making faces at its blandness, both sides laughing, both sides learning. And in the mornings, one might find a sailor sitting quietly with a child beside him, showing how to tie knots in rope, or an elder showing a captain the way smoke curls in certain winds, a hint at weather come. These were small moments, almost invisible in the grand sweep of history, yet they were the threads that wove the larger fabric of cultural encounter. Breathe gently now, because here comes a softer truth. While later times would bring shadows of exploitation and balance, in these earliest stretches there was often a mutual reliance, a recognition that each needed the other. Ships could not survive without food and water. Locals found fascination, sometimes utility, in the strange tools, fabrics, and stories the sailors carried. And so, for days, weeks, sometimes months, life settled into this rhythm of give and take. Even worship, though different in form, found points of contact. Sailors kneeling in prayer at dawn, locals performing rituals at sunset, both groups watching one another with curiosity, perhaps even with respect, recognizing devotion in gestures, if not in words. And over time, some sailors left behind more than footprints. Relationships formed, friendships deepened, and occasionally, bonds of love or kinship tied them to places they visited. Imagine a sailor sitting beneath a tree, listening to a young woman sing softly in her own tongue, not understanding the words but feeling the meaning in her voice. Imagine a child learning to say a sailor's name, giggling at its strangeness, then repeating it until it became familiar. Stay with me, for this is where the story slows into tenderness. Explorers may come seeking routes, riches, and glory, but what many found, at least for a while, were moments of belonging in places they never expected, hearts open to them, meals shared, kindnesses extended. And when the time came to leave, when sails were hoisted once more, there was often sorrow mingling with hope. Gifts were exchanged again, this time with heavier meaning. A necklace pressed into a sailor's hand to remember, a knife left behind as a tool, promises spoken though not understood, carried instead in tone, in tears, in embraces. Sailors rowed back to their ships, glancing over shoulders, waving, watching figures shrink on shore until they were only silhouettes against the trees, and from the decks they lingered long, staring until land itself disappeared into haze. And on shore, too, hearts were touched, stories told of strangers who had come and gone, songs perhaps adapted to remember, tools incorporated into daily life, fruits and memories alike planted in the soil of time. Breathe slowly here, and feel how this quiet, human side of exploration carried as much weight as maps or treaties. It was not only the meeting of worlds, but the blending of small routines, of food and song and care, and though history rarely records the names of those who shared fruit, laughter, or music beneath foreign stars, their unseen hands held the story steady. So let yourself rest in this image as the chapter closes. A quiet shoreline at dusk, fires flickering, sails fade in the distance, voices soft with farewell, and in between, the calm truth that for a time, strangers were no longer strangers but neighbors bound together by the oldest forms of exchange, kindness, trust, and the simple will to live side by side. When ships finally turned their bows homeward, sails billowing with winds that seemed to whisper both longing and return, They carried more than spices, timber, and curiosities. They carried memories, impressions, and fragments of lives shared in faraway places. And these intangible treasures became just as powerful as a cargo store below deck. For in Europe, the taste of a new fruit or the sight of a painted feather could ignite entire waves of wonder and imagination. Imagine sailors stepping ashore after months at sea, their boots striking the cobblestones of Lisbon, Seville, or Venice, carrying baskets of coconuts or bundles of cinnamon. Their clothes faded, their skin weathered, yet their voices eager as they spoke of islands where bread grew on trees and rivers shimmered with fish that glittered like silver in moonlight. Crowds gathered at taverns and markets to listen, eyes widening at tales of parrots that spoke in human tones, of spices that perfumed the very air, of people whose greetings came in song. And though details blurred and sometimes stretched into exaggeration, the effect was the same. Curiosity grew, heart stirred, and imagination stretched beyond the familiar horizon. Stay with me, for here is where the gentle twist unfolds. The age of exploration was not only about discovering new lands, but also about reshaping Europe itself, slowly altering its rhythms of taste, its patterns of trade, even its dreams. Consider the first time cinnamon or nutmeg slipped into European kitchens, how its fragrance filled narrow homes with warmth so different from the earthier scents of local herbs, or how sugar, once rare, began to appear more often, sweetening bread, tea, and even celebrations, until it became not just a luxury, but part of daily life. Imagine farmers gazing at seeds brought back from across oceans, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, planting them in cautious rows, watching them sprout, unsure of their worth until, with time, these crops became staples that would sustain entire populations. And think of how chocolate, bitter when first encountered, was carefully transformed with sugar and spices into a drink that nobles cherished, a comfort in cold winters, a sign of refinement. These were not simple changes. They were revolutions of the palate, of the body itself, shaping diets and health, weaving new flavors into the daily fabric of Europe. Stay with me a little longer, because beyond food and trade, something subtler also grew, a curiosity about the wider world, a hunger for knowledge that went hand in hand with taste. Books began to circulate, written by explorers and sailors, illustrated with sketches of exotic plants, animals, and people, their pages turned by candlelight in quiet homes or great halls alike, sparking conversations that blurred the boundary between myth and reality. A parrot feather displayed in a noble's chamber was not merely decoration, but a symbol of distant possibility, a reminder that the world was larger, stranger, more beautiful than anyone had imagined. And in port cities, one could hear new rhythms of music, songs adapted from foreign shores, melodies carried in sailors' memories, humming through the alleys until they mingled with local tunes and became something entirely new. The quiet presence of those who had traveled further than most could imagine also altered social life. Men who once were simple fishermen returned with tales that made them seem like storytellers, sages of the sea, their voices carrying both awe and caution. Some told of calm encounters, of kindness exchanged. Others spoke of challenges, storms, and hardships, but always, the horizon loomed larger in listeners' minds. And here's another gentle truth. The age of exploration did not only expand maps, it expanded hearts and minds, teaching people that the familiar was only one part of a vast, interconnected tapestry. In towns far from the ocean, where most had never seen a ship, the ripple of exploration was still felt. Spices and markets, fabrics dyed with brighter colors, stories sung by traveling merchants, each a fragment of faraway shores, arriving like soft waves lapping at Europe's door. And while kings and merchants measured profit, ordinary people felt something quieter, a sense of wonder, a subtle stretching of their imagination as they tasted, smelled, and dreamed of places they would never see. Let yourself picture a family gathered around a table, a dish flavored with something entirely new before them, their faces lighting with surprise, or a child gazing at a carved trinket from across the sea, turning it in her hand as if it held the key to a world she might someday touch. Stay with me in this image, for it shows how deeply exploration seeped into daily life, not through dramatic conquest, but through the smallest, most human details. And as Europe absorbed these influences, it also began to mirror them back. Ships departing again, now with new goods to trade, new ambitions, new questions, each journey building upon the last, like ripples widening from a single stone dropped into still water. The age of exploration was not a sudden blaze, but long twilight, soft and steady, reshaping evenings by the hearth, kitchens filled with scents, stories whispered at bedtime, songs that drifted from taverns into the streets. And so, as this chapter settles, rest in the image of Europe not as a place untouched, but as a landscape slowly transformed, where horizons no longer ended at the edge of fields or towns, but stretched outward, endlessly outward, to seas and stars and voices from beyond, blending into a new, shared story of humanity's gentle expansion into the world. And now, as the long arc of the age of exploration bends toward its gentle close, picture the world not in sharp contrast of conquest and empire, but in the softer currents of exchange, of curiosity, of shared wonder that stretched like invisible threads between shores, tying distant peoples together in ways that could not be undone. For even as ships returned in years past, the stories, the flavors, the knowledge, and even the silence of what remained unknown lingered in the air like the fragrance of spice carried on the breeze. Stay with me as we move slowly through this twilight, for the final chapters of exploration were not about sudden discovery, but about absorption, reflection, and the dawning recognition that the world was infinitely larger, infinitely more intricate, than anyone had imagined before the sails first unfurled toward open seas. In quiet libraries and monasteries, maps became more precise, but with each new coastline traced, more blank spaces remained, hinting at horizons still waiting. In gardens, strange plants bloomed beside familiar ones, their colors bright against the soil, reminding all who tended them that what was once foreign could become home. And in parlors and halls, people read aloud from travel accounts, voices soft, their words lingering in candlelight, while listeners leaned forward, both enchanted and reassured, knowing that humanity's story was now woven of many threads, not one. The sailors who once seemed restless wanderers grew old and told their tales more slowly, their voices cracked yet steady, teaching the next generation not only of storms and stars, but of patience, of the long quiet hours between waves, of the gift of listening to distant voices with respect. Let us breathe slowly here, and notice how the age of exploration, which began with a bold cry of adventure, ended with a quieter wisdom, that the world's richness was not meant to be consumed in haste, but cherished in wonder. Think of a harbor at dusk, ships rocking gently, their sails furled, their timbers creaking softly as gulls wheel overhead, and the water glimmers like molten gold beneath the setting sun. In those harbors, where journeys began and ended, ordinary people lived lives touched by exploration in subtle ways. A cup of sweetened chocolate, a scarf dyed with indigo, a story carried home and told beside the fire. And these details matter more than the grandeur of kings, for they were the heartbeat of daily life. Stay with me a little longer, for as the age of exploration yielded to new ages of science, of empire, of industry, what remained constant was humanity's longing to know, to reach, to connect, and this longing has never ceased. Even now, when we look at the stars or step into an airplane, we echo those same rhythms of curiosity, the same slow expansion of horizons. And so, as the story draws toward its end, imagine yourself resting by a quiet lamp, listening not to the clamor of history but to its hush, to the way waves lap against the hull in memory, to the way maps rustle softly as they unfold, to the way voices of long ago whisper across time, not demanding but inviting. This is a gift of the age of exploration. Not only the goods, not only the knowledge, but the reassurance that beyond every horizon there's more to learn, and that each step outward can also be a step inward toward patience, toward humility, toward the calm recognition of our shared place on this small, spinning world. So breathe slowly now. Let the sails lower, let the harbor lanterns glow, and let this journey settle in you as a gentle warmth, a reminder that history itself can be a lullaby. And as you rest, know that the story continues, not in distant lands, but in you, each question you hold, each moment of wonder, each horizon you dream of reaching. Sleep safely now, with the soft knowledge that the seas have been crossed, the stories have been told, and the night is yours to carry them gently into your dreams.